Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 20 of Changing the Face of Yoga. This is third in a four-part series on the future of yoga, and I'm speaking to Tom Meyer of Anatomy Trains. We're going to be discussing the newest research in somatics and how that might affect our thinking about regulation of yoga. I want to introduce Tom Myers today. He is the author of Anatomy Trains, 3 editions, 2001, 2009, and 2014. The co-author of Fascial Release for Structural Balance in 2010, and numerous articles for trade magazines and journals that have been collected in the books Body 3, The Anatomist's Corner, and Structural Integration Collected Articles. He's also produced over 15 DVDs and numerous webinars on visual assessment, fascial release technique, and the applications of fascial research. Welcome, Tom.
Stephanie, thank you. It's great to be here.
We're not going to talk about those, though. I met Tom at a conference, and he said something that was very intriguing to me, which was to discuss current research in somatics and how this research is taking somatics in a new direction and how that affects yoga. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Tom, let's start off with some basics. Tell me what somatics research is.
Well, somatics comes from the Greek soma, which is kind of the counterpart to psyche. So you'd have psychological studies and then you'd have somatic studies. It's a little different from biochemistry. It's the whole felt sense of the body, and that's not something we've explored a great deal, is how we feel things and how we change how we feel things and how the way we feel things contributes to our consciousness, to our responses to things, and we get into the place where the mind and body meet through the hormones, the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight system, these immune systems. I'm sure you've been hearing the research that links up your emotions, your chemistry, and your diet and motion and the rest of it. And so this is the century that we're really turning our attention to consciousness, and consciousness of the body is part of that. Nobody's really studied consciousness up till now because it was the idea of objective, and you can look objectively at a door or a painting or a molecule or an electron or a star or a nebula, but you can't look objectively at how you perceive things because that is the person who is looking, right? So it gets very confusing when you try to catalog subjective experiences, and that's of course what we're all of us as human beings are, just a series of subjective experiences. We're not really objective scientific experiences. Scientific experiences are one small subset of the whole human experience. So it's a very difficult thing to study subjective experience objectively, but that's what's beginning to happen. We're beginning to understand how we feel things and how different people feel different things, and how we can then use that feeling to produce more mature responses in both our kids and the people who really should be mature.
Oh, yeah.
People of my age, for instance, should be grown up, but often aren't.
I understand that, yes. I should be grown up too. Okay, so really somatics is very different from what I thought. It's actually this kind of nexus between the body and the physical body and all the rest of it. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. I don't want to dissuade you from what you want to know. What did you think somatics was?
I thought it was just the body. I just thought it was, bones and muscles and fascia and all that kind of stuff. But it's actually, because that's my problem with yoga research is yes, we do asanas but how do you measure what happens in yoga, because we have so much more than just movement. And so this is really exciting that people are trying to look at the holistic view instead of just the different parts. So you say that's what somatics has been. You say there's new research that's coming along, and what would that be?
Oh, well, it's in all different directions. You're looking at how enzymes and hormones work in around stretching, what's happening in stretching, and strengthening as well. Of course, where yoga stops and personal training begins, or Pilates, or those kinds of things are kind of dubious distinctions, right? There are more active forms of yoga that would more approach a personal training thing. There are very meditative forms of yoga that would not look like exercise at all, but would still have some commonality to them in terms of what they're doing to the fascia, what they're doing to the nervous system, what they're doing to the fluids of the body. So those are really areas where that research is going on. What's happening in neurology in the fascia and the muscles? What's happening in the chemistry of the neurology in the muscle, of the chemistry in the muscles and the fascia? And then what do we do with that afterwards? That's less of a research question. Yes, that's more of the practical question of how is that going to change how you do your yoga. If I understand from looking at your site, you're doing a lot of yoga with older people. Is that true?
That's true. Yes, that's my niche.
Yeah. What happens with people as they get older is that parts of the body fail to get used. Yeah.
Right.
And those areas that fail to get used, there are sensors in that part of the body, little stretchy springs, and if they don't get stretchy sprung, then they kind of, after a while, they wither and they can't produce a signal anymore until you get into that area and stretch it. And yoga is very well worked out to, by the time you've gone through a whole sequence of yoga poses, you have tackled lots of different parts of the body and made sure that they're moving. And in that way, you create a stimulus from the stretch receptors. These are Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles, if you've heard of them. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of other ones, paciniform corpuscles and Meissner's corpuscles and all these Buffini endings and different things. They all give you different information. We can talk about that if you want. Up to the brain, and the brain can't organize a movement in a place it hasn't felt. So the great thing about yoga, you do pigeon. You're going to feel stuff around the back of your hip joint that you don't feel. Right. As you settle down into that pose, or you're going to feel it along the front of the leg. Where you're going to feel the stretch, of course, depends on where you're tight. But let's say you're going to feel a stretch, as a lot of people do in pigeon, in the forward leg, if they really get that lower leg kind of crossing like a T. Mm-hmm. You'll feel it as you settle down into that hip in the piriformis or the obturator internus, deep to the glutes in the deep butt. And that's going to send a bunch of signals from those receptors, those Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles, that haven't been sent for a while. So the brain wakes up and says, oh, hello, didn't know you were there. And then when you go to walk, you did it in a yoga pose, and it's great that you did it in a yoga pose, but the more important thing is that part of the body then becomes available to you as you walk, as you scooch down to pick something up, as you reach up to get something, that more parts of your body are participating. And generally we work along the idea, and this is not proven by the research, but it's kind of an intuitive idea that we all hold, which is the more of your body that participates in any given action, the more, the less likely you are to injure yourself with that kind of movement, and the more enjoyable it's likely to be.
At least I've been taught that there is research that at around the age of 70, the muscle starts to turn to fat. Is that because we aren't stretching those muscles, that we're not using those muscles, or is it really more of a hormonal or an endocrine kind of thing that's what happens as you age?
First thing I'm going to do is absolutely say that that's wrong. I do a lot of dissection. I do a lot of dissections. All of those people, not all of them, but the vast majority of them are in their 80s, and I can assure you their muscles haven't turned to fat. Muscles turn to fat if you don't use them.
Okay.
We occasionally see people, for instance, who have been in a wheelchair for the last few years of their life. Their lower leg muscles will not be entirely fat, but they will have largely turned to fat because, and paralyzed muscles or muscles to which the nerve has been damaged, they will turn to fat. It still takes some time, and that's with zero use. But you'd be amazed. You might think you're not using your muscles at all, or that somebody's not using their muscles at all, but honestly they are. And I can assure you that there are people in their 80s who die with their muscles looking really good, looking very much like muscles not invaded by fat, and quite there for use. But then there are also places in the body that have been, as I was talking about before, forgotten and not used, and that's the design of yoga, is to progressively work your way into those parts of the body that you don't use regularly.
Okay. Oh, I like that. That's much more positive. I can talk to my students in a more positive way with that one. Then I like that.
Yep, I really would. I really think you'll find that the people who've lost their muscles all the way into fat are the ones who've been paralyzed in some way.
Okay. Now take us from this new direction in somatics to how this is going to affect the yoga industry.
We can all be surprised by the future, but the
Yes.
the yoga industry is, I would suspect that the yoga industry is going to find itself fitting into more and more social niches. So really a lot of the classes, when I first started, I'm very old, so when I started out there wasn't any yoga available at all, or it was this really freaky thing that you could only get in conjunction with the health food store on the other side of the tracks, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
So and now really it's available in every health club and on lots of corners, especially if you go to some place like Toronto or, New York, there's yoga everywhere and available everywhere for people, and that's great. That's wonderful. I'm really glad that it's that way. But what it also means is that we'll be moving out into other niches. In other words, yoga for more elderly people, yoga for pregnant people, yoga for young and fit people, yoga for people who are about to, going through traumatic things like divorce, or yoga for grief. I can imagine, I'm just making this up, but I can imagine all kinds of ways in which yoga will be applied in particular institutions, in schools, in prisons. I have a friend who's a yoga teacher who spends her weekends teaching in the local state prison, and I'm sure she's doing a lot of good for people, who would otherwise be wrapped up in that. And so yoga has, I think, a lot of applications that people will be using that in order to calm themselves, in order to get their minds ready for tests, in order to stay mobile while they're aging. I think there's just a whole lot of applications that this kind of research will have. I don't think that it will, let me try to be a little controversial for your listeners here, and say that I don't think that all of this is going to look like traditional yoga coming out of, what we were doing with Iyengar in the 1970s. I think yoga will take on different forms to fit with the 20th century. The people who were developing the yoga asanas, even Iyengar himself, with the progenitors of Iyengar and other people of his generation, were trying to do this with very, very different people. The Brahmins of the 1800s or 1700s in India weren't facing the same problem that kids who are growing up in the electronic era are facing today. So we might have to develop quite a different yoga to answer the needs of the kids from this era. So those people who want yoga to look exactly the same probably are going to be disappointed. And those people that understand that yoga means union, and so we're going to ask ourselves how we're going to get joined up, well, then we might have to develop a yoga that looks a fair bit different. Besides, we might be teaching yoga over 3D, virtual reality goggles. We might be teaching yoga that way in a shorter period of time.
Oh, that's an very interesting idea. Yeah, because I have a little trouble, because I work with a vulnerable population and older people. I have a little trouble with canned video yoga classes, because I just wonder how how you can do that. I mean, how you know what that person is on the other side of the, camera or whatever.
Okay, I have exactly the same thing when people tell me, oh, I do the same thing that you do as a body worker. I have this stick and I roll myself with this stick, or I roll myself on this ball or foam roller or something. I'm going, no, a foam roller doesn't have nearly the intelligence that my hands have. Yeah. So, but the counter to that is not everybody can afford to come and see my hands. And so I think Yoga Glow and these other places that supply video yoga classes are probably doing a service for those people who can't reach a class. I think that's great. I absolutely agree with you. Being in a class is a different experience, and I would say having a bodywork session is a very different experience than rolling over milk balls or Yamaha things. Even though I think those things are wonderful, it's not a substitute for bodywork. So I would say the same thing about the video yoga classes. They're not a substitute for a real class, but sometimes a real class isn't available. And if you're in a hotel room or something, I sometimes tune in those classes, and that's a useful thing for me to do when a class isn't available.
True, but you also know what you're doing.
Yes, it's exactly. Those things are most helpful for people who've already had a class, right?
Yeah. You feel that basically yoga is going to expand its purview, shall we say, to be able to meet the needs of very different students, which of course is actually the whole goal of this podcast, so that's wonderful. But why do you believe that it's going to have to change in regards to regulation and training?
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, that's a different question. That's the regulatory question. And which country are you in?
I'm in Australia, but I'm basically I grew up in the U.S., so I know both places.
Yeah, I just wondered whether you were podcasting into the U.S. It is different
yes,
from country to country. It is different from country to country, and I don't want to get totally tied up in U.S. concerns, because the U.S. is a complicated place because you have 50 separate subdivisions in the states that regulate things rather than one federal countrywide legislation. So these things get a little more difficult there. But the pathway in which this happens is that the industry, in which I'm talking about yoga teachers and yoga therapists, has to first start regulating itself. In other words, forming a committee and figuring out what the educational standards are, the ethical standards are, whether you're allowed to sleep with your students or not, or whether, talking to them is ethical. All of these things have to be worked out. We in bodywork took some of the things from psychology and we applied those to bodywork. Well, some of them applied and some of them didn't, because psychiatrists, psychologists, for instance, are not touching their clients, and we are.
Right.
And that's a different kind of animal, and so yoga has a different set of responsibilities. But I really have great sympathy with those people who say, I don't want to be regulated. Who the hell wants to be regulated? But if you don't get regulated, the thing is that somebody sets up down the street from you. They're doing terrible yoga. They're injuring people, or they're psychologically damaging people. And if you don't have a yoga teachers association or a yoga teachers licensing, then you have no recourse to say that person isn't doing good yoga therapy. So the trouble, it's bad to be regulated, but it's worse not to be regulated.
Yeah.
And I think that yoga teachers and yoga therapists will find that in the long run, their interests will be served by having a standard that everybody has to meet, and then you can call yourself a proper yoga therapist, and then that's just based on research, or anything that is based on my experience with what happened in several industries that I've been involved with, and the bodywork one, that it is better to have regulation, and then it doesn't stop people from doing different things, but it means that if somebody who's really not able to do this work, not capable of doing this work, or taking this work to bad effect, won't ruin everybody's reputation in town. In other words, you have recourse. And if somebody in the public gets hurt, they have a recourse to go and say, this person did me wrong. And then, there's a board and things like that. It's a very, you wish you didn't have to do it, but it really is something to be considered for yoga. And I hear a lot of people in the yoga industry saying, we don't need this, we don't want to be regulated. In the end, it will be better for you than not, in my opinion.
Well, they're also saying that there's all these yoga teachers out there that aren't well trained and are giving the whole industry a bad rep. And so those are just two sides of the same argument. That you if you don't have regulation, then anybody can do it, as you said. I'm a little.
And the regulations shouldn't be so stringent that those regulations, and it will end up this way in the end. The regulations are designed to take the dregs off the bottom, not the cream off the top. There'll be still a wide variety of people working in a wide variety of ways, but if you can't pass those tests, you really shouldn't be charging the public money. Because if you can't answer basic questions, you're really not competent, and you don't want that person practicing in your name as a yoga therapist. You ought to be able to stand up and say, hey, I did 500 hours of training. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm talking about, and I'm willing to put this certificate on the wall to prove it. And if you don't think I know what I'm talking about, then you can haul me up in front of a board, and I take responsibility for my professionalism. And in the end, that's a better position to take. Anyway, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. You said that, you basically are talking about self-regulation, which is, in my case, all the yoga teachers, the yoga therapists get together and say, okay, these are our standards and here's our board, and if you have problems. Do you find that to be really, I have a little trouble with it, because usually the boards are being paid by the yoga teacher training or the yoga therapist training people to get the certification that says, yes, we are certified by, International Yoga Therapist, or we're certified by Yoga Alliance or Yoga Australia. Do you feel, I just wonder if that works, because basically what you're doing is you're going in and you're saying, okay, great big yoga training Inc., you're doing a bad job and we're going to decertify you. And then that means that this board or this organization loses the money that this big Yoga Training Inc. gives them every year to be certified. And so I'm wondering if there isn't such a conflict of interest there. I wonder how efficacious it really is.
There are ways of insulating boards from those conflicts of interest, and if you get into this, as you as an industry get into this process, you'll find those things out. Yes, politics is everywhere. There are ways, however, of ensuring that the board has independence, and what you want is a board with some teeth in it, but that can't wholesale run around and kick everybody out of the business. And I've seen both of those things happen. I've seen it where boards were so ineffective that they weren't offering any regulatory control.
Yeah.
And so it was a free-for-all, and I've seen boards that offered too much regulatory control, and usually those things sort themselves out within a decade or so. Maybe somebody with too much, a real control freak gets hold of it for a while, and they make life a living hell for everybody, and then then somebody throws them out, and somebody more reasonable comes in. You just have to hope that the yoga world is reasonable enough to come up with a reasonable governance structure, and I think it definitely is.
Yep.
Most yoga people are quite reasonable, and you set reasonable standards, and when somebody breaks those standards, you know that there are occasional scandals in the yoga industry where a teacher is sleeping with a bunch of their students or something, and that gets regulated in the marketplace in some ways, but it ought to also be, as we go into all these different niches that I was talking about at the beginning, there ought to be some way that you could take somebody who really doesn't know what they're doing and bring them up in front of some kind of responsibility. And that's what you're looking for. And I think in yoga, it is already happening in the United States, that kind of self-regulation. And what happens is when yoga self-regulates, when any of these things self-regulate, and then you go to the states and you say, see, we're self-regulating. The state, the government of whatever province you're in or whatever country you're in is saying, oh, you're already self-regulating? That's wonderful. You go right ahead and you keep doing that, and we'll put our stamp of approval on it. If you come in and say, we're not regulating ourselves at all, and we don't like those guys over there, and we want to do it, then the legislatures say, oh, you guys are too much bother, and everything gets delayed and nothing happens.
Yeah.
So it's better if we can get together inside of yoga and say, this is what we're willing to put ourselves up for as being responsible for, and that generally works out pretty well.
Okay. Let's recap here. you're seeing this research in somatics, which really is a holistic look at how the body works. The hormones, the bones, the consciousness, all of that together, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I really love that. And so what you're finding there is that the movement that yoga has in it also affects all of these other things, or those other things also affect the movement, so that it's not just the muscles and the bones and the fascia, it's all the other stuff.
Let's talk about how the movement affects the other things, because I think this is where you're going, and I hadn't gotten there before. We now know that particular kinds of movement wake up particular genes. You will regularly have people coming to your classes, and they'll say something like, before I started doing yoga with you, my periods were all over the place. 20 days, 30 days, I never knew when my next period was going to come. And then I started doing yoga, and now my periods are hitting every 28 days. Now, there's nothing in doing triangle pose or camel that would make you think that your periods are going to regularize. But what in fact happens is when you start seriously stretching the body, you actually turn on certain genes in the body and turn off certain other genes in the body. We didn't know that this happened until quite recently, and now we know more than that. It's not just a chemical cascade. It's not that you're turning on certain genes because you're turning on certain chemicals. You actually pull right into the genes you actually pull right into the DNA with that actual pull that goes through the membrane of the cell, through the cytoskeleton of the cell, into the nuclear membrane, into DNA, exposes a different part of the DNA, and makes you express new things. Now, that's not unique to yoga. Let's say if you started to run, you would be turning on certain other genes, maybe some of the same genes, but maybe some other genes because you're doing running, and you would be turning on certain other genes if you do meditation. And you also turn on certain other genes if a negative experience happens to you. There's certain genes turned on in trauma. They're not going to have such nice effects maybe, but they're trying to protect you. So all of these things turn on different genes. Yoga is quite well designed to turn on the genes that are associated with movement, which will lead toward health. And so we're not surprised to find heart irregularities coming out, or bowel irregularities coming out, or, as I was talking about, period irregularities, or things like that, resolving themselves, not the kind of things that you think would respond to stretching, because this reaches right down into how we express ourselves chemically, how we express ourselves as a biological unit, if you'll forgive the word. And that includes these, what's called epigenetics, which is turning on of different genes through, in this case, movement.
All right. I've always said that yoga gets into your bones, and I never understood quite what that meant, but it just does seem to go to your body.
It absolutely does. It's going to affect your consciousness. It is going to affect your bones. Yeah. It will make your bones stronger and more resilient from the stretches you put in, provided you're going into that donut, which is enough of a stretch to exert a strain on the body, and not too much stress so that you injure the body. And right. That's always the trick, is staying in the middle of that donut. You have some people come into class who are just doing way too much and they're going to injure themselves, and you have some people come into class who don't exert themselves enough to really make a difference in their body. So the trick is to take the middle ground.
I'm still trying to recap this so that it makes sense, which is with this research in somatics about how movement is affected and affects other areas of the body, including the hormones and how the brain's working and the nerves and all of that, you see how valuable yoga can be. And as other movement is, I'm not saying it's just yoga, but and you said that to be part of the system in the future, to be at the table to talk about this, yoga has to regulate itself and look at its training. What do you mean by being at the table? What's at the table that's going to help yoga?
Let's do it the other way. What is not being at the table going to do to harm yoga?
Okay.
If Yoga Australia or Yoga America gets together and says, we are practicing an art here, if this is not a medical thing, this is a meditational art, and we don't want to be regulated, so please don't regulate us. And So the legislature says, okay, we won't regulate you. And the harm is then that anybody can set themselves up as a yoga therapist. There's no checking on it. And so Susie Cream Cheese sets up as a yoga therapist down the street, and she starts giving people sciatic pain. You who are a legitimate yoga therapist, who are really helping people, you can't do anything except lament that, oh, Susie Cream Cheese is not a very good yoga therapist. But in the minds of the town where you live, everybody's going to associate you with Susie Cream Cheese because you're both called yoga therapists. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the advantage of the regulation is that the word yoga therapist starts to mean something, and then there's a second benefit. And the second benefit is that the physiotherapist can't come in and say, oh, you're doing physiotherapy, sorry, you can't do that anymore because that's our domain. You have a thing that has been established, has a regulatory status to it, and other people can't throw you out. Massage therapists or physios or occupational therapists who could say, these stretches are occupational therapy and you can't do that because you're not an occupational therapist. If you didn't go for regulation, you don't have a seat at that table. And when you don't have a seat at that table, the occupational therapist can come into, say, the legislature and whoever's making the laws, the regulatory boards, and say, these yoga therapists are injuring people and we need to take this back into occupational therapy. And if you haven't been at the table, you can say, but nothing's going to happen because you don't have a seat at that table, so you can get legislated out of existence if you try to exempt yourself from regulation. This doesn't take place over a year, but it does take place over a decade, and suddenly you can find yourself the Rolfing community in New York State in the States suddenly found themselves really having to either go out of a job or work illegally because the massage industry stepped in and made it very difficult, not illegal for them to work unless they went and got a massage license, which was a 2,200-hour affair in New York. It was it was the kind of thing you're talking about where the massage industry came in and, kind of cornered a whole group of people because they were a smaller group of people. And because structural integration, Rolfing had said, we don't want to be at the table, we don't want to be regulated, they had no recourse. And that's the situation in New York to this day.
Tom, I really want to thank you. This has just been fascinating. I really appreciate you having thought about this. I think you've brought up some points that are going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, but also some... Then my work is done here. You're happy, huh? But you've given some very good reasons about why you think the way that you do, and some very good examples. Tom, I really, really want to thank you for being on the podcast. I think this is going to be one of the more interesting ones that go out and people listen to. So thank you so much. Yes, if you'd like to get a hold of Tom, he's at info@anatomytrains.com, and his website is www.anatomytrains.com. And you can also... Can I put in a plug, Stephanie, for anatomytrains.com.au? Because that's our Australian site. Okay. So there is also an anatomytrains.com.au. Yep. Just courses there in Australia. Yep. Okay. So anybody that's interested in what Tom talked about fascial release and that kind of thing, the somatics, can look into those if that's of an interest to you. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate it, and it was great talking to you. Great. You take care. You too. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.